Hello, in this video I want to start a new series for the space privatization resolution that's coming up for LD, or I guess it's already started. I've kind of already judged at one or two tournaments where people are already debating the resolution, and I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening, and so I want to continue to kind of contribute to what's going to really be going down for this resolution and talk a little bit about Afro-Pessimism as it relates to space privatization. I really enjoy doing these series because I really get to have an idea to really break down what I think are some core central ideas for the resolution, what criticisms I think are really going to be kind of moving into the next phase of what really becomes the meta, and places where I think people can have a little bit more work in terms of how they are responding to these things at a much more nuanced level. And so hopefully this series is really helpful in terms of accomplishing that. In this video I really just kind of want to talk about some of the central ideas that make Afro-Pessimism particularly pertinent to the space resolution. What are some of the main ways that Afro-Pessimism is used on the affirmative, and some of the ways that it's used on the negative, and then how does this kind of fit into the space privatization resolution as a whole. We've already talked about racial capitalism in the context of space and settler colonialism in the context of space, two criticisms that I think are super important to the idea of spatialization and how we think about the history of what leads us to space. But I think that Afro-Pessimism kind of adds into some of the central questions that we've kind of talked about in some of these other circumstances, to really raise a question of what a lot of these things mean in the context of how slavery has evolved into a particular relationship to humanity that crafts and centers the desires for them to be able to kind of move on into a way that not only cleanses from the past of slavery, but actively kind of creates and affirms the human as something that is made distinctly in relationship to the denial of the slave humanity. And I think there are a lot of things to kind of talk about how this is oriented in space, and how it's kind of definitely related to a lot of the ideas that are talked about in racial capitalism, but maybe figured differently in terms of its historical conjecture and what it means for a lot of the more offensive arguments that you'll read on this resolution. When I'm thinking about just what are some of the most central arguments that kind of make this good on the affirmative and negative, I feel a lot of the things that are really important for Afro-Pessimism on this resolution is, I think that what's really good is that this resolution doesn't require the creation of an alternative space program. It just requires the ability to kind of affirm the resolutional question, which is that the privatization of space is unjust. And I think that there are a lot of things to say about why, for instance, this type of privatization is bad, particularly from the lens of Afro-Pessimism, because I feel it makes a lot of the kind of negativity and refusal questions from Afro-Pessimism a lot more generative. I definitely think that there are a lot of arguments to be made about why, for instance, space and the glorification of space is kind of the perfection of our ability to understand how civil society is able to secure itself, because it is able to kind of continually not only create and reaffirm the kind of humanistic nature of what spatialization looks like and how you're able to kind of ascend into new spaces, but also there's kind of this ability to create the post-human, which is even kind of a worse, or creates an even kind of more violent paradigm, because of the way that it opens up how you're able to how you're able to kind of think about what the term for going to space is, and why the particular idea of being able to create the post-human in relationship to that subject for space only kind of situates the ability to kind of extend all of the violence of humanity into something that's kind of race neutral, into something that's colorblind, that washes away the violence and the specter of what really is the violence of slavery. And I think that kind of considering all of these questions is super important to think about why the kind of central statement of the resolution is unjust, which is really where I would be working from if I was kind of on the affirmative side of things. This is why I think that not only can you kind of offer a differential relationship to space, but I think that in the context of how this specific resolution is written, a lot of for instance, the stay and the hold arguments are methodology comparisons to the resolution, because I feel they kind of have that distinction, and that the agent distinction and mechanism distinction from the central core of the resolution, but you're still able to make arguments about why you deny space privatization, right? I think that you could make an affirmative in the context of Afro-Pessimism that says no to space as a whole, because of the way in which it kind of perfects humanity in such ways, why it kind of ultimately is able to represent the ascension of white humanity in the context of science and technology, and the kind of perfection of such a subject in a way that that creates a hegemony around whiteness as not only a kind of human, the center of humanity, but as something that kind of guarantees the survival and continuation of humanity into other worlds. I then think that when you're on the negative, there are so many arguments to be made on this resolution, particularly about like why the way in which other people are thinking about like how you should check the resolution are bad. I feel like in the context of what are some of the most like relevant policy affirmatives for this resolution, a lot of them are about ways in which like different uses of kind of like a public space program or something that's kind of like outside of privatization can open up new means for like various types of countries to gain access to using space to and create a larger like control over just international relations as a whole, or the international stage, or being able to kind of like create a way to use space as like a place for particular type of resources that are necessary for the public. And I definitely think that Afro-Pessimism is able to like make a lot of arguments not only about like why the particular spectacularization of the type of like impacts and things that they're kind of like overhyping in order to say that space can resolve these problems are particularly dangerous and damning because of the way in which they kind of like secure a world where civil society is ontologized to the point where anti-blackness is necessary in order for it to continue. And also I think there are a lot of arguments to be made in terms of like why the kind of like the resourcification of various types of space is exactly why the kind of like difference between the public and private in terms of their uses of space isn't distinctly different, and why it still requires there to be a critical understanding of like why there is no redistribution from the public sector. I think things like public trust doctrine or other arguments that are really about like how the public can be engaged in terms of like how these resources get used are like particularly pertinent to the question of pessimism, because of the way in which it's able to indict how the public isn't restorative or redistributive in the context of anti-blackness, because slavery is something that we're supposed to kind of like get over through the linear trajectory that allows us to project ourselves into the future and into space in the first place. And then I think for a lot of the critical affirmatives, it really is this kind of like classic debate between your ability to be able to articulate pessimism and why it's not a question of why we should refuse all freedom dreams in the context of like critical theory and different alternative versions of futurism, but why the question of freedom dreams should be tied to how does it reinstantiate or use a kind of grammar of suffering that is like particularly latent in the context of like civil society, and how does that recreate various types of forces of violence that only kind of like not only restructure the same type of violence that is like done under like what would be understood as a public space program, but also is able to erase it under the idea of being radical, of being leftist, of being like different and anti-status, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's divorced from humanist or post-humanist desires for how we relate to the concept of space overall. And I kind of want to start exploring like what a lot of these debates start looking like in particular context for thinking about debating this on the affirmative and the negative versus policy teams and critical teams, and how other teams should respond to it. And so hopefully this video is a good kind of like starting point for like where a lot of the central criticisms will come from, and it'll turn into more stuff I'll be talking about with Afro-Pessimism and space as a whole. So hopefully this video is helpful for you, and tune into more videos I'll be doing. And yeah, thank you as much always for watching.